So, like pretty much everyone else in the world, I saw Avengers Endgame, and for the most part, in pretty much every way that matters, I was extremely satisfied. It was everything I wanted and more. It was a fantastic resolution to the story of Infinity War and the Infinity Saga as a whole, and it leaves things on what feels like the perfect note for some of these characters. But above all else, it struck a very particular chord with me, and that has to do with what I've always perceived to be one of the greatest weaknesses of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is finality, or lack thereof. Since that first post-credit scene with Nick Fury in 2008, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has been all about expansion. The story of the Avengers, the Guardians of the Galaxy, the Defenders, the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and so much more grew and grew to the point where it was honestly daunting to try to engage with all of this material. But with that expansion comes the danger of overinflation, of building and building and building, but never really delivering a proper payoff. With the MCU's seemingly endless roster of films and TV series in development, it was starting to feel like these characters could continue on indefinitely, or at least until the actors' contracts ran out. And for me, at least a couple years ago, that idea was making the whole universe start to feel a little stale. It was hard to be too invested in what was happening in one movie when I knew the characters would be in 3 more in the future. Finality, even the idea of finality, is very important to storytelling. I'm a firm believer that good stories should end, and shouldn't wear out their welcome. Christopher Nolan didn't have to end his Batman series on a trilogy, but he did, and that made the final entry feel all the more important in the context of that series, and all the more disappointing, but that's a video for another day. The MCU hasn't ever really had that same sense of finality. The films build to crossover after crossover, but there's always been more on the way. Before Age of Ultron was even released, Marvel announced the entire Phase 3 lineup, which contained almost twice as many films as in the previous phases. There was no end in sight. To be fair, the series has attempted to present some kinds of resolution through the various interconnected trilogies that made up Phases 1 through 3, but those resolutions were somewhat undercut by the fact that the characters' journeys still continued. Tony Stark accepted his dual identities and understood that being Iron Man was about more than wearing a suit, but his story continued. Steve Rogers ascended beyond being an icon of the past, rejected the mantle of Captain America, and let his beliefs define him rather than a sense of duty, but his story continued. Thor learned that Asgard meant more than the idealized city he grew up in, and he sacrificed it to save his people's future, becoming the king he was meant to be. But his story continued. To be clear, I don't think this is inherently bad. I actually think some of these characters' best moments have happened after their trilogies were complete, but the stories overall were just continually building. As the Marvel crossovers got steadily bigger and busier, the journeys of these characters seemed to be never-ending, and while I was always excited to see more of them, I guess I wanted to know that these stories could end. And Endgame proves that these stories can not only end, they can end in satisfying ways. That may seem like a bare minimum expectation for any story, but the unique structuring of the MCU always made it seem like a difficult task at best. These characters have been around for so long and have cohesively passed through so many different creative voices that there was no clearly defined endpoint. The source material certainly doesn't have a definitive start or end. New stories are being written for these characters all the time. They're constantly being reinvented, and the future of comics is pretty much indefinite. To me, the MCU was beginning to build up a similarly indefinite tone, and it's hard to stay invested in these stories when it feels like they're never going to stop. So, the fact that Endgame was able to culminate so many character arcs, continue and tie up so many ongoing story threads, and end the stories of some major characters in such perfectly satisfying ways is a big victory for this universe. Because the characters have always been the driving force behind the MCU, I was concerned that Marvel would be afraid to retire some of their big names for the sake of financial stability. But now, Tony Stark, the character we followed from the very beginning of this universe, is dead. His story is over. His character's motivation dating back to the first Avengers film was resolved. He was finally able to rest. Black Widow did the same. She gave her life to help secure the future that would bring her friends back. The Avengers, the only thing that was giving her purpose. And death isn't the only way to end these stories. As with Captain America, they can be poetic without sacrifice. Cap's ending, where his character is effectively retired, lets him make a choice beyond the objective greater good for the sake of his own happiness, which is very reflective of how his character has evolved. There was nothing else for him to do, and he finally had a chance to live the life that was taken from him. He got his dance. It was beautiful. The same can be said for Hawkeye. Even though his ending is essentially the exact same thing as Age of Ultron, he retires. He returns to his farmhouse, presumably to hang up his bow forever. It's a very weird feeling after following the growth and development of these characters for so long, for half of my life, that I won't see them in these roles again, at least not in the same way. They can always make more prequels, I guess, but I hate prequels so much. Also, as much as I appreciated the closure for certain characters, the openness of other characters' endings was also satisfying, in a very different way. I was really surprised that Endgame didn't explicitly set up any future films, villains, or conflicts aside from Thor joining the Guardians, which is a really exciting idea. I like the idea of Thor going around on space adventures and popping up sporadically in future cosmic movies. He doesn't really need to be a core Avengers character anymore. In that sense, Endgame does create hope for the future, which it had to, because this isn't the end of the MCU, but the unalterable changes to the universe are what makes it land so well. Also, I guess Professor Hulk is still out there too, just like dabbing in diners and doing photo ops. So, while Endgame is factually not the ending of the MCU, it is an ending, and the fact that this universe can commit to that and move forward without some of these main players at the forefront is relieving. Of course, maybe in 6 years Robert Downey Jr. will want a nice big fat paycheck again and this entire video will be rendered null, but that hasn't happened yet, so it still counts. I mean, I assume it won't happen anytime soon, especially since he's starring in that Dr. Dolittle movie that cost $175 million and got pushed back 9 months and is undergoing extensive reshoots. I'm sure that'll be a hit. I think it would be naive to assume we're never going to see Tony Stark or Steve Rogers on screen again, and we're getting a Black Widow movie, so these characters aren't gone, but they were still given endings, definitive, plot-important endings that can't be easily undone without cheapening their emotional weight. I hope Marvel commits to these choices, and that we don't see these characters again for a little while, and if we do, I hope it's in small, inconsequential ways, because their story is over. I want to see how the newer characters function in a world without them, where they have to step up and be the heroes that define this universe going forward. If the old characters have to be brought back in, it should be in mentor roles, like what will probably happen with the upcoming Hawkeye series on Disney+. We can only pray that this haircut doesn't come back with him. Obviously, they couldn't have given definitive endings to every single one of the original Avengers in Endgame, but the film prioritized the most dramatically important ones. And if the rest are quietly retired over the next few years and phased out in favor of Black Panther, Spider-Man, and Doctor Strange, I think it's for the best. What it really comes down to is the medium of entertainment that Marvel is operating in. These movies may be based on comics, but they're not comics. They don't and can't function exactly the same way. When you're following the stories of these tangible human beings, no matter how superhuman they become, you can't just bring in a new artist to make them a decade younger when the story's getting stale, even with that digital de-aging. For a film trilogy, or a long, ongoing, interconnected series of films, there has to be an endpoint, and Endgame is the perfect endpoint for the first iteration of the Avengers. This movie was the first in the MCU to give me a real feeling of finality, and I didn't realize how much this series needed that until it happened. And it makes me hopeful for the future of the universe as a whole, because now I know that Marvel is capable of ending those stories in satisfying ways, and the time will come when the newer characters will need that. that. I look forward to those endings and to see what characters will emerge to replace the characters we already know. Will it be Howard the Duck? It should be. Above all else, I'm really curious to see when the MCU will actually definitively end, because it has to at some point, and I'm sure plans are in place if these movies suddenly start tanking or something. But so far, Marvel has made one of the most successful and unconventional film franchises in history, and who's to say they won't just follow the Phase formula to another successful saga across the next decade? And the next decade after that, if it keeps working. I'm sure something along those lines will happen, but I hope they keep in mind how important endings are to these cinematic stories. Endgame may just be the first in a long series of endings for the MCU, but if future endings can match its celebratory, emotionally rewarding heights, then I can't wait to see the next one. And if that ending happens to star Howard the Duck, it'll be a $2 billion opening weekend. Easy, I'm calling it now. So guys, those are some of my thoughts on Avengers Endgame and Finality. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like it and subscribe if you want to see more. See you next time.